Hey guys, I'm Thoufiq. Now, if you're someone who wants to learn SQL from scratch, or you're someone who has already learned the basic SQL but you're still struggling and you're not very confident in SQL, then this video is for you. Now, in this video, I'm going to explain you the step-by-step guide on how to learn SQL. We'll see what are the different concepts that you will need to cover in order to learn SQL and what is the sequence in which you will need to learn these concepts. I'm also going to mention what are the different concepts that you will need to learn in order to write basic SQL queries, and we will also see what are the different concepts that you will need to cover in order to write intermediate level of SQL queries. We shall also cover what are the advanced concepts in SQL that you will need to learn in order to write complex SQL queries. Finally, at the end of this video, I'm going to mention few fantastic resources that you can follow in order to learn all the different concepts that are mentioned in this video. Now, before I can start, if you're someone who wants to learn how to write complex SQL queries or how to write intermediate level of SQL queries, then from next week, that is 7th March 2022, I will be starting some live SQL training sessions on Lighthall, where I will be teaching the process of how to write complex and intermediate level of SQL queries. Now, during these classes, basically it's going to be 6 different sessions over a span of 2 weeks. I will be solving around 15 to 25 different intermediate to complex SQL queries, and when I'm solving this, I'm going to explain the approach and the method of how to solve them and the thinking behind solving these intermediate to complex SQL queries. So if you're someone who is interested in learning how to write complex SQL queries by live training, then definitely be part of that session. All the details that you will need to join these classes will be mentioned in the video description, so definitely check that out. Finally, before I can start, if you find some value from any of my videos, then definitely consider subscribing to my channel, and if you like this video, then give me a thumbs up. Thank you, and let's begin. Okay, one final thing is that everything that I will be mentioning in this video, all the different SQL concepts, all the different resources that I will be mentioning for learning is going to be mentioned in my blog as well. So everything I will summarize this and put it in my blog. So I'll leave the link to my blog in the description below. So definitely check that out as well after you watch this video. Now I have categorized the learning of SQL into 5 different sections, as you can see here. The first thing is that you need to learn is you need to understand the SQL fundamentals. I'm going to tell you when I say SQL fundamentals, what are the different things that you need to cover. Then you need to learn the SQL commands, and I'm going to tell you what are the different SQL commands that you need to learn. And then you will need to learn certain concept that is required to write basic SQL queries. And then we will see what are the different concepts that you will need to write intermediate level of SQL queries. And finally, we will see what are the advanced concepts in SQL that you will need to learn in order to write complex SQL queries. Okay, and if you are starting from scratch, I would recommend that you learn all of these concepts in this sequence itself, like how I'm going to be mentioning them in this video. Okay, so let's start with the first one and let's look at each of this section in detail. Okay, so the first section is understanding the SQL fundamentals. Now it's the most basic thing. Now if you are someone who has already learned SQL and you have never looked at these fundamentals, that is still fine. But the thing is, whenever you're learning something new, new programming language, it's always good to understand the foundation of that language or the fundamentals of that language, because by learning these fundamentals, it's going to help you to understand the later concepts much easier. You will be able to relate it with better examples, etc. Okay, so when I say SQL fundamentals, you need to understand what is data. Now we know that any information or non-information can be data, so you need to know what a data is. You need to know what is a database. Now in short, database is basically a container that stores data, so you need to have that basic understanding. You need to know what is an RDBMS. Now RDBMS and database are two different things. Now RDBMS is a relational database management system. It's kind of an application that sits between a database and an end user or our application, right? I'm not going to explain all of this in detail. If you want me to explain all of this in detail and take separate SQL basic classes or live training, leave a comment below, so I might think of conducting some live basic SQL training as well. Okay, so basically you need to understand what is data, what is database, what is RDBMS. Then you need to know what is SQL. Now not just the full form of SQL, that stands for structured query language, but you need to understand what is the purpose of SQL. Why do we use SQL? How is SQL useful? Okay, so you need to understand that, and after that you need to understand how data is stored in a RDBMS, right? Because we know that data is stored in a table, but everyone who wants to learn SQL should understand that data in a relational database is stored in tables. So how tables are formed, how do you know that tables are related, and what is the structure of a table, and how a table is formed? All of this basic understanding you need to have, right? So once you have all of this fundamental understanding, then you are pretty good to start learning the next thing, that is the SQL commands. Okay, now as part of this SQL fundamentals, what you should be doing is, once you understand all of these concepts, The next thing is you should install a database in your machine. Now you can install any database that you prefer. The most popular RDBMS are PostgreSQL, Oracle, MySQL, and Microsoft SQL Server. So or there are many other relational database as well. So any database of your choice, any relational database of your choice, you try to install them and also have an IDE installed for that database. So for example, I use PostgreSQL primarily. So primary PostgreSQL is my database and pgadmin is the IDE or the tool that I use. Now if you are using MySQL database, then you have the MySQL Workbench as the IDE. So whatever you prefer, you can use it. But once you have understood this SQL fundamentals, definitely you need to have a database installed on your machine. So once you're done with this, the next thing that you will need to learn is the SQL commands. Okay. Now when it comes to SQL commands, as you can see, there are 5 types of SQL commands. So we have DDL commands, DML, TCL, DCL, and DQL. Okay. Now I'm not going to explain you what each of these commands are in detail, but I'll give you a short summary. Okay. Now let's first look at DDL commands. Now as part of DDL commands, you can see here I have already mentioned the different commands that you will need to learn. Now as part of DDL, we have create, alter, drop, and truncate. Now DDL basically stands for data definition language, which basically is a command that basically used for creating or modifying or dropping the structure of a database object. Okay, so one of the database or one of the most popular database object or most widely used database object is a table. So if you want to create a table, drop a table, modify a table, then we use DDL commands. Now truncate is a command which is used to remove all the data from that particular table, right? So this is what truncate does. Now I'm not going to explain in detail all of this, but when it comes to DDL commands, you need to be thorough with all of these 4 commands. Okay, and when it comes to creating a table, there are a couple of things that you need to learn. The first thing is what is a data type. So you need to understand what data type is, what is the purpose of data type, what does data type actually do. Okay, now there can be so many different data types and different RDBMS can have their own data types as well. But in common or in general, I would say you should be familiar with these 5 data types. So it's varchar, int, date, float, boolean. So you should know what is the difference between these data types, why it is used, and when you create a column with this data type, what is the value that it can hold. Okay, now there are several other types of data types as well, but you don't need to cover each and every data type. But these 5 that I have mentioned here, if you can cover these 5, then I think you will be in a pretty good state to basically understand any other data type that you might come across in the future. Okay, so once you are thorough with data type, the next concept that you will need to learn is constraints. So you need to know what a constraint is and why it is used. Now there are several types of constraints. You definitely need to understand what a primary key is, what a foreign key is, what is unique key constraint, what is check constraint, and what is not null constraint. Now there are a few other types of constraints as well, but you don't need to learn each and every constraint. But if you are familiar with these 5 constraints, then I think you will be in pretty good state. And especially you should understand what a primary key is and what a foreign key is. A lot of people get confused with foreign key constraints, so definitely spend some additional time to understand foreign key and how it actually helps to build relationships. Okay, so that's one thing. So once you are thorough with constraints and data types, I think you will be thorough with how to create a table and etc. So as part of an exercise when you are learning this DDL commands, right, what you should be doing is you should try to create a sample database. So in the previous step, you have created basically you have installed a database and you have an IDE, right? Now go to or log into that IDE and then create a sample database, and then inside that database try to create some sample tables, and then try to create tables with different data types with different constraints, try to create multiple tables and just do some experiments with that. Okay, so whatever you learn, right, you need to use that practically, only then you kind of completely understand that. Okay, so this is some basic exercises that you will need to do. Okay, so when it comes to DDL commands, so once you have learned these DDL commands, the next thing that you will need to learn is the DML command. So DML basically stands for data manipulation language. This is basically a language that can help you to load data or modify data in your tables. Okay, so we have insert, update, and delete commands. Now these are the 3 most widely used commands that you should definitely be familiar with. These are very basic things. The syntax is very simple and you just need to learn it, and then you need to just do some experiments. Just try to insert some data, modify some data, delete some data, and just try that out with a couple of tables, then you get some hands-on experience with that. Okay, now there is another DML command called merge, but it's not very widely used, so I would say that this is optional for beginners, so I'm just going to mark them as optional. Okay, now as part of exercise, again, as I told you, you need to, whatever table that you have created in the previous step, right, try to load some data into that, modify some data, etc. So once you do all of this, right, you kind of get hands-on experience, and that kind of will improve your confidence in using SQL, and all of these are very important when you later come to writing SQL queries. Okay, so definitely spend some time to understand these DML commands. The next thing is TCL. Now as part of TCL, we have commit, rollback and save point. Now save point is optional, we very rarely use that, so I'm going to mark them as optional for beginners. But commit and rollback is something that can be used to save the changes into the database or remove some unsaved changes from your database. So definitely check that out. Once you run a DML command, try to run the commit and rollback and see how the data will change when you run these commands. Okay, so definitely learn TCL commands. And then the DCL commands. Now DCL commands basically stands for data control language. Now I would say that this is optional. It includes grant and revoke. This is basically when you want to provide permission or revoke a permission for a user based on certain objects, right? Now I would say for a beginner, you don't really need to worry about this, so I would say just ignore this for a beginner. But of course, if you have some experience, then, and if you have some time, definitely you can learn this. But for beginner, I would say you can ignore the DCL commands for now. Okay, and then finally DQL, which basically has just one command, that is the select statement. Now as part of this, just try to write one simple query at least where you use select, from and where. Try to understand what this is. Now select is basically a clause where you mention your columns, right? This is basically what will be returned by your select query. So every column that you want to get returned from your select query, you mention it under select. Then in your from clause, you mention all the tables, and then in your where clause, you mention all the filter conditions. So try to have that basic understanding, and then try to write couple of queries where you just use select from where, and just do some simple experiments using the tables that you have created previously here. Okay, so once you have these basic understanding of SQL commands, then you are ready to start writing SQL queries. So now let's look at what are the different concepts that you will need to learn in order to write basic SQL queries. Now, as part of basic SQL queries, right, I have mentioned here, first thing that you will need to learn is all the different operators. So we have comparison operators, arithmetic operators, logical operators, and then we have union and union all operators, etc. So you don't need to know each and every operator. It's actually pretty simple. So it's like the same thing that we used in mathematics in our school days, right? So how do we compare between two columns? So if we want to do an exact match, then we use equal to, and if we don't want to match it, then we do the not equal to. We have the less than, greater than symbol. Then in arithmetic operator, we have basically all this addition, subtraction, multiplication, etc. Then the logical operator, try to write some SQL queries which has some where conditions, where you have and operator or operator. See how the data will differ when you have and or. Try to use the between, try to use the like, and see how the data will change. So try to write some queries where you're using all of these operators. And then also check these two operators, that is union and union all. These are two operators that can be very handy in certain scenarios. So definitely check this out as well. So as part of writing basic SQL queries, these are the four type of operators that you should be familiar with. It's very simple. I think it would hardly take you an hour or two to understand this. If you have some basic understanding of mathematics, then this should be pretty simple. So definitely spend some time and write some SQL queries where you're using these operators, and see how the data or the result will differ when you're using these different types of operators. Okay, so once you have written SQL queries using some of these operators, then move on to write an SQL query where you are using a case statement. Now case statement is very important. It's very simple, but it's very important because it's very widely used, right? So try to write some simple SQL query where you're using a case statement. So case statement is something like an if-else statement in other programming languages. So based on certain condition, you can display certain other values or match certain other values. So try to write a query where you're using case statement. After that, try to write some queries where you're using these clauses like distinct, limit, and order by. Now in some of the RDBMS, I think you don't have limit, but you have top, but basically they both kind of do the same thing. So try to see what these clauses will do and how you your query output will change when you're using any of these clauses. So try to write some SQL queries using these clauses. And finally, try to write a query where you're joining multiple tables. And in order to join multiple tables, there are several types of joins, but for now, as part of a basic SQL query, just focus on inner join. So the first join that you should be learning is inner join. Try to join multiple tables using inner join and see how you can do that. Okay, so once you are able to do all of these, so all the operators, the case statement, these clauses that I have mentioned here, and then the inner join, you should be able to write any basic SQL query. Okay, so this is basically your preparation that you will need in order to write basic SQL query. So if you just want to just get basic understanding of SQL, then I would say that you just focus on understanding the fundamentals, focus on understanding all the different SQL commands, and then just focus on these concepts that I have mentioned here in order to be able to write basic SQL queries. Okay, so once you are able to understand these basic concepts to write basic SQL queries, the next thing is to look at what are the other concepts that you will need to learn in order to write intermediate level of SQL queries. Okay, and this is where it kind of becomes very interesting. Now, as part of intermediate level of writing SQL queries, you will need to get familiar with what are subqueries. Now, as part of subqueries, there are a few different types of subqueries. Scalar subqueries. Okay, it's scalar subqueries. Then we have multi-row subqueries. We have correlated subqueries. Now, I have made separate videos about subqueries and also a few other concepts that I'm mentioning here. So if you want complete tutorials, then you can check those videos in my channel. So I try to leave a link in the description as well. Okay, so you will definitely need to be familiar with subqueries, and then you will need to be familiar with group by and having clause. Now, this group by is very, very important. We use it almost everywhere, and it's kind of a topic that, or a concept which kind of confuses a lot of people. So try to spend some time to understand group by and having clause and also subqueries. Okay, and then try to spend some time in understanding different aggregate functions. Now we have max, min, sum, average, and count. These are pretty simple, but try to write some queries where you're using aggregate functions, and mainly try to write some queries where you are using aggregate functions with the group by clause, and then try to write SQL queries where you are using aggregate functions without the group by clause. Okay, try to see the difference, because we can use aggregate functions with group by as well as without group by, and see how that works. Okay, try to write SQL queries using that so you get some understanding. Okay, and then finally try to write some SQL queries where you're using some other type of join. So mainly the outer join. So we have the left outer join, right outer join, full outer join, cross join, etc. So try to write some queries where you use this outer join, see how the data will change based on this outer join, because this is different from inner join. So if you want complete understanding about joins, I have made a couple of videos about that, so definitely check that out. And also important to understand what cross join is. Certain cases cross join can be pretty useful, so try to understand that as well. And then finally, the two last things that you will need to learn is certain inbuilt functions. Now, there are several different inbuilt functions, but mainly focus on certain inbuilt functions which can be used for date conversions, like to date or date format or cast. So these are the functions where you can change the format of a date from one format to another, or you can convert from one data type, from a varchar to a date data type, or something like that. Now, it's very important that you are comfortable using these date conversion functions, because in some cases, it's going to be almost impossible to proceed without using this date conversion function. So definitely try to write a few queries where you're using this inbuilt date conversion functions. And similarly, also try to use certain inbuilt string functions like substring or position or in string. These are basically certain functions where if you want to extract a certain string from a text, then you can do that using these functions. So try to write some SQL queries using this as well. So I think in general, these are all the concepts that you will need to learn in order to write intermediate level of SQL queries. So subqueries, group by, having clause, aggregate functions, the few types of joins, mainly outer joins, and then your inbuilt functions for date conversion, for string conversions, etc. So all of this you should be familiar with if you want to write intermediate level of SQL queries. Right? So once you are done with this concept, the last thing that you will need to focus on is certain advanced concepts to write complex SQL queries. Now, as part of this, I have mainly put the self join. Now, self join is also a type of join, but it is slightly different from any other type of join. And self join is very, very useful in many cases when you think that you are not able to solve a problem. you can then solve that problem just by using self join. So there are certain scenarios where a problem can be easily solved by using self join. So definitely understand what a self join is. So if you want to write advanced SQL queries or complex, if you want to solve complex SQL queries, then you should be comfortable with self join. And then the next thing is with clause or the CTE table. Some people call it like CTE table, some call it like with clause, whatever it is. It's a pretty simple concept, but it's something that can help you to really improve your SQL query or to make your SQL query very neat, or helps you to write better SQL queries. So definitely try to get comfortable using with clauses when you're writing SQL queries. And finally, one of the most useful concepts in SQL is window functions. Now, if you want to say yourself that you are able to write complex SQL queries, then window function is something that you cannot escape. Now, there are several types of window functions. You don't need to be comfortable with each and everything, but mainly you should know how to use a row number, how to use rank, dense rank, first value, last value, lead, lag, nth value, etc. Okay. Now there are few other window functions as well: end tile, percent rank, accum dist. Now you can learn this if you have the time, but I would not say that this should be your first preference. Your first preference should definitely be everything that I have mentioned here, right? And then finally, you also have something called as a frame clause that you can use in window functions to modify your output, or in certain cases when you are not getting the expected output, you might have to apply certain frame clause to do that. Now this is something that I would say keep it for the last, the frame clause and all of these window functions. If you are able to cover all the other concepts that I have mentioned here, then if you have the time, then definitely focus on frame clause and these remaining window functions. So I think as part of complex SQL queries, if you are able to be comfortable with self join, with clause and window functions, then I think you should be able to write pretty complex SQL queries. Okay, so finally, let me showcase certain resources that I think you should follow in order to learn all the different concepts that have been mentioned in this video. So I'm just going to show them. So the first resource or the website that I would highly recommend is W3 Schools. Now, any SQL syntax that you want to learn for any concept, then you would basically find that in w3schools.com. Here you would basically find SQL, I think, for different RDBMS as well. So definitely check that out. If you want to learn SQL syntax, then W3 Schools is a fantastic resource. But let's say you want to do some SQL courses. So if you want to do some good SQL course where every single concept that you are going to be learning is explained in the form of SQL queries, then learnsql.com is a fantastic platform. Now I have made a separate video explaining why I highly recommend learnsql.com for any SQL course. You can check that video out. I'll try to leave the link to that video in the description below. So if you want to do an SQL course, then learnsql.com is a fantastic resource. And finally, let's say you want to practice writing some SQL queries. So you have learned all the SQL concepts and now you want to practice writing SQL queries. So whether you want to practice basic SQL queries, intermediate SQL queries or complex SQL queries, then Strata Scratch is a fantastic platform. So I highly recommend that. I'll leave the link to that in the description below. And finally, there's also another platform called LeetCode. Here also you would find some SQL questions that you can solve right there on their platform. But the questions on LeetCode I think are pretty basic. So if you want to just find some basic SQL questions, then LeetCode is a good platform as well. And other than that, if you want to find some tutorials to all the different concepts that have been covered in this video that I mentioned that you should learn, then you would find several different tutorials on my channel as well. So you can definitely check out my channel to get a detailed description about all the different concepts that have been covered in this video. Okay, so these were all the resources that I highly recommend. I hope this helps. So I think that's all, guys. If you are able to cover all of these concepts, then I think you should be able to feel confident in SQL. Now, I have not included the performance tuning part because performance tuning is something that you generally don't learn as when you're getting started with SQL, right? I would say once you are 2 years or 3 years of experience, that is when you start learning the performance tuning concepts in SQL. So that is why I'm not including them here. I hope you found some value in this video. If you did, then definitely give me a thumbs up. And also, if you are interested in joining my live training session where I'm going to teach you how to write complex and intermediate level of SQL queries, then definitely join my class, which starts from 7th March. All the details are there in the video description. So thank you guys and see you soon in the next one. Bye.